How do you reduce wait time? So all these queues, these lines, these places that people are waiting to purchase your product, or maybe they're waiting to receive your product, right? All of these wait times, how do you start to eliminate or reduce those? Now, the first thing that you should do before you make any changes is go to Gemba. What is Gemba? That means to go and see where the work is being done. So if you work in a retail shop, watch how do customers interact with the checkout? What do they do with the checkout? How long does it take people to move through your line? Now, if you're looking at maybe internal processes of making your product, let's say you're a bakery, then watch how does the dough, the ingredients come together to make the dough? How does the dough get laid out? Where do we go ahead and have it rise or bake? And then how long does it sit between going from one oven to another oven, right? Are there any wait times in there? But the best thing that you can do is to go to Gemba, to go and see where the work is being done. So do that by completing an observation. Go there with no intent other than just watching a normal day. Talk to the person and let them know, hey, I'm here just to see how things work from day to day. And do an observation. Document it, write it down. So it's really easy for us to lean on assumptions, to lean on kind of our personal preferences to get those special projects moving forward, but those might not actually identify the biggest bottlenecks. So you can simply do an observation and collect times by writing down each process step that you see and how much time it takes. So you should decide before you go in the increments of time that you're going to do. Are you going to do seconds or minutes or hours? But I really recommend doing it exact times if possible by minute, right? Otherwise, we tend to kind of go 5 minutes this way or 15 minutes that way, and it sometimes loses its valuableness. Now, what this does for you is it allows you to identify bottlenecks. So you are only as fast as your slowest step. You are only as fast as your slowest step. So when you go to Gemba, when you do this observation, when you watch that process that takes the longest is your bottleneck, right? So you can never really get too much faster than that process. You can never get faster than that process. So make sure that you start to identify those bottlenecks, and then you can apply things like the theory of constraints to reduce or eliminate that bottleneck and go after the next one. Now, easy ways that you can start to identify improvement opportunities outside of just general waiting. One, how do you identify waiting? It's really easy to identify. You look for the line or the queue. That's where you're waiting. Now, if you're in a virtual environment, this might be harder because maybe the queue is not as visual, but that's where you might see a backlog, right? A backlog is indicative of some kind of waiting, of some type of waiting for somebody to help you, of a call to be answered, of a maintenance order to be completed, right? Those are all indicative of waiting. Now, another thing that we often have to wait for are decisions, right? So if we reduce decisions, the less we have to wait. When you do this observation, you can also lean back on that downtime, that defects, overproduction, waiting, not using people well, transportation, inventory, motion, excess processing. Do you see any of these wastes within this process? If you do, those are opportunities for improvement. Now, when we talk about waiting, as I said, here's some of my tips to make sure that your processes do not build in waiting. Decision points. Whenever you have a decision or approval point, you are building in wait time to your processes. So if you force your employees to have your approval to do something, they will have to wait for that approval. So the best thing that you can do is to reduce or eliminate decisions, approvals. Is there a way to standardize that? Maybe if you're talking about purchases, especially if you start to calculate how much it costs for you to make this decision. Maybe only purchases over $100 need to go through you. All other purchases can move forward. Another point in the waiting game is handoffs. So every time you take a piece of work and you hand it off to another person in the process, or they hand you a piece of work, that is a waiting point. That is a transition point. Every step in our process has the opportunity to be a mistake, right? So the more steps that we have, the more handoffs we have, the more chances we have of making a mistake. You want to reduce the chances as much as possible, and you want to reduce the waiting. So reduce or eliminate handoffs as much as possible. Another thing to look for is what steps do you have to keep in this process and what steps can be done externally. So internal versus external steps. So for example, when you're making, if you were working at the bakery and you're making your bread and your dough, and then you stop making the bread and the dough to go ahead and assemble the boxes that the bread is going to be in. That is not something that needs to be done while you're baking bread. That's something external. So rather than doing that as part of your process of making the bread, wait until nothing else is going on for you to go ahead and do those activities. When you bake bread, just focus on baking bread, right? So identify if there's any of those external steps, those steps that could be done later or before in this process to reduce that. Now, that might be very apparent at the cash register. At the cash register, if the person has to assemble the box while the customer is waiting, that's an external step that maybe the boxes could have been prepared before the customer got to the cash register. We already talked about that downtime waste. Now, there are opportunities for you to highlight or identify waiting before it has a major impact that hits your customers. And I always recommend these daily huddles. So some kind of connection with your team, ideally daily, where you just spend 5 or 10 minutes identifying any of their barriers. So they have the chance to say, hey, I'm waiting on your approval. And you're like, whoa, I didn't even see that email, right? Now, overall, what we end up doing is balancing our work, right? When we look at these process observations, what we want to do is we want to balance the work between all the different people in the process. So if you go to Subway or Chipotle, you will see that each piece of their process, let's say at Chipotle, they have one person doing the tortillas. They have one person doing the veg. They have one person doing the cashier. So someone has gone through and identified how to make those three functions fairly balanced, that those three functions take about the same amount of time. So finding that balance, because as I said, you're only as fast as your slowest step. So if you try to take some of those steps from your slowest step, maybe you can balance those amongst somebody else that's not as busy. So these are just a few of the tips and the things that you can do to stop waiting for your employees, for your customers, make that line or queue go down. That's actually one of the ways to start to reduce your backlog.